CURES is sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.
Helping you lead a healthier life. This is CURES.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to CURES. This is the show where we explore cutting-edge wellness from credible sources. I'm Sundlun, and this is National ADHD Awareness Month, and it's observed in October, really to raise awareness on the understanding of attention deficit disorder, all the different types of it, and we're certainly learning a lot more about it. And to help us through the process, maybe you need a diagnosis for your child or need to understand, do you have this? Dr. Laura Saunders is a psychologist at the Institute of Living, and she's joining us now so we can dive in. Thanks for being with us, Dr. Saunders.
Thank you for having me, Kara.
And I say that because a lot of adults now are getting diagnosed, and in fact, we can just start there, that a lot of adults are getting diagnosed, and some are saying, oh my gosh. I mean, I've even seen some things online where they start crying. They're like, oh my gosh, no one ever told me. This is why it's not me, I'm not lazy, I'm not, there's nothing wrong with me. My brain is wired differently. And so let's just talk about that. How does ADHD show up? Because it's not just about not being able to focus.
Right. So let's start with some basics, Kara. ADHD is really one of the most, if not the most common neurodevelopmental disorder of childhood, right? It is, in fact, a disorder of childhood, but that doesn't mean that, as an adult, you may sort of uncover that these symptoms that you've been experiencing actually always date back. And that's how we make the diagnosis, is we have to date it back to before age 12. So it's not like, I just developed some inattention in adulthood, because actually one of the rule outs in adulthood is anxiety, because anxiety symptoms can cause you to have difficulties with attention and concentration, not so much the impulsivity, but the impulsivity, because I know we're going to talk about core symptoms, the impulsivity starts to look a little different over the developmental trajectory as well. But it's pretty common neurodevelopmental disorder. It's diagnosed in childhood, but usually lasts into adulthood. It just kind of modifies its presentation.
Yeah, I mean, the more that we understand about it, it really is a brain being wired differently. A lot of folks are saying, let's not even call it a disorder. Let's call it, it's actually good in some situations. My business is filled, they say, with folks with ADHD because we work really well under pressure or have a lot of deadlines. But let's get to the symptoms, which definitely can cause a problem in places like school. So what are the core symptoms?
Right. So we have a few core symptoms, but I want to address another point that you brought up, which is, why do we even call it a disorder? And I mean, this can be very, very much debated, but one of the reasons for certain issues we call it a disorder is because that's how we treat it, right? That's how you get medication, is that you have a disorder. So by using the word disorder, we're not just trying to pathologize things. This is a subgroup of individuals whose brains work kind of differently. We call it a disorder, A, to help them identify, and B, it helps with treatment. So I just wanted to address that point. Let's get back to.
Yeah, because and at least in our current system, and I get that why some people are saying it can be advantageous in certain situations, but in our current system, you're not going to get treatment or accommodations or anything unless you recognize that there's a disorder, or some people want to call it difference. But some of the difference are some of the common symptoms. Help us understand, because again, a lot of people are just like, oh, that just means like you're kind of fidgety and you can't focus. It's so much more than that, right?
It is more than that. So the most common symptoms are inattention, impulsivity or impulse control, and it's usually poor impulse control, easily distracted, motoric restlessness, and difficulties in concentration. So those are some of the core symptoms. As we go into some of the deeper levels, it's difficulty with organizing tasks, and really looking at how attention and concentration affects, first of all, schooling, and then you take those same core symptoms and look at how it impacts whatever work environment you might be in.
So if you need a diagnosis and you're thinking, gosh, I recognize a lot of this, either in your kids or yourself, how do you start? How do you get a real diagnosis?
There's a couple different ways to do it. You can see your pediatrician. Most pediatrician offices have some of the self-report measures. to look at. You can, talk to a mental health professional, usually a psychologist. You don't necessarily need to go all the way to a psychiatrist, but you do if you want medication. But most psychologists that do child and adolescent work know how to diagnose and use some of the self-report measures for looking at ADHD and getting a diagnosis. And it's important in childhood because a diagnosis, helps you identify what's going on, helps you understand it, and can get you those accommodations in school if that's what your child needs.
Yeah. And sometimes it's very obvious, okay? My son is open about the fact that he has ADHD, and I would say that at a very early age, we knew that he was always moving, he couldn't sit still, highly creative, but easily distracted. I mean, I felt like sometimes they look like, oh, that's really obvious, right? Overactive boy. But important to note that it doesn't always look like that. And we need to look at even some of the inattentive side.
Right. So you're bringing up a couple good points here. So yes, and I do like to point out that we take into account the fact that there is a range of what is considered at least fairly or moderately typical in terms of like motoric restlessness and activity level and impulsivity, right? So it's not, otherwise many boys, if not all boys, would be labeled as having ADHD, and that's not the case. We really look at that. And when you do this for a living, or when you have a lot of experience, you know those kids where it's really just outside the range of typical. And I use typical and atypical, not abnormal, because I don't want to pathologize anyone. But what's more typical and what's outside the range of typical. So when we get into gendered issues, what we see is that girls tend to have the subtype where it's just more the attention deficit disorder without so much of the H, which is the hyperactivity component. And so therefore, because of that, girls tend to be diagnosed later. And when it's more the organizational aspects of ADHD that make it really difficult. So in middle school and high school, when tasks become more long-term and they're multifaceted, that's when difficulties in organizational skills really have an impact on the ability to function in school.
Okay, so executive function, a word that maybe people are hearing a lot, but it really means the type of function where you're organizing and planning, which already is confusing because kids aren't that great at it to begin with. It takes a little while to even develop that part of your brain, right?
Absolutely. So, right, executive function is that kind of part of your brain that organizes things. So there's multiple different, there's multiple different tasks in any given situation, and your executive functioning helps you organize the different parts of what needs to happen. It helps you organize your attention or your concentration or your activity. It helps organize a bunch of different things. That's a very rudimentary way to understand executive function, because it's actually a term that's tossed around a lot these days. And I don't know that people truly understand it, but that's a very rudimentary understanding.
Okay, so just to review here, in order to get a diagnosis, we're talking about having trouble organizing, we're talking about losing focus, getting easily sidetracked, but you need a certain number to get a diagnosis, right? This is, you as a professional would say, I need to see X to diagnose ADHD.
Yeah, it needs to be outside the range of typical. I mean, I don't, as I said, there's a bunch of self-report measures, and you get scored on those self-report measures. So it's not just looking at someone saying, you look pretty hyperactive, you have ADHD. It actually, there is a process to the diagnosis.
Yes, 6 or more symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity for kids up to age 16, and then 5 or more for adolescents ages 17 and older. So the idea that the hyperactivity, at least the external version of it, might not be as obvious as you get older.
Right. And again, when, depending upon how severe, because like a lot of different things, it's, kind of on a range, right? It's not that it's a black and white. You have ADHD, you don't have it. I mean, you have it to the point where you cross over into the criteria, but it's, even then it's still in a range. So when we talk about the inattention, right, it's 6 or more symptoms, often fails to give attention to close details, makes careless mistakes, trouble holding their attention on tasks and activities, does not seem to listen when spoken to directly, does not follow through on instructions, often has trouble organizing tasks. So there's a whole series of symptoms that we look at.
Yeah. Often leaves seat in situations when remaining seated is expected, often runs about or climbs when not appropriate. So those kinds of things I think people were accustomed to hearing. And then some of the other ones might be that we just need to be digging a little deeper. So let's say you have a lot of these. You can do at school, they might be able to give you, and your pediatrician, right? You'll do like a Vanderbilt form or maybe a Connors report. There's these standardized forms and you can get the diagnosis, because the point would be then to get to treatment. So my understanding is treatment, although medication can be life-changing, it's not the only thing. In fact, in young children, they really are recommending twofold, right? Educating the parents, parent behavior therapy, and also sometimes medication can make a huge difference for these kids.
Yeah, I would even say threefold, right? So it is parent education. That's a huge part of it. It's understanding that your child's wired a little differently and modifying, not necessarily reducing, but modifying expectations. So you don't give a kid who has significant ADHD a 4-step direction. You need to do A, then B, then C, then D, and expect them to follow through with it. They're not going to hold it. And then you're going to be frustrated with them. So it's understanding from a parental perspective how to manage things a little differently. Yeah. It's definitely the child themselves or the adolescent. It's also the school, and schools are well versed in this at this point. And we haven't even gotten into like, at what point do you need medication, right? There's interventions that you can have in school or accommodations that you can have in school that are well before the point of medication around your seating preferences and your time allotments and your support with organizing. There's lots that can happen in terms of accommodations.
Right. So let's start there. If you get that diagnosis, then the next thing is you might have to create a 504 plan or an IEP. You're going to go to this meeting and and I've helped some friends through this because I feel like I've been through a lot of them, but like you're going to go sit down and the idea is to come up with some accommodations. If you're at a really good school, they're going to know a few accommodations that might work, but otherwise you might have to advocate. So what are some of the most common accommodations you would like to see in some of these plans that would help kids at school?
So it really is based on age and developmental level. I do think it's helpful in kids who have a diagnosis of ADHD that they have some kind of either educational testing or intellectual testing, because it really gives you a foundation to understand what their strengths are, what their deficits might be, and how those deficits are actually impacting their education, right? We want kids to be in the least restrictive environment. We want them to be in a setting where they're going to thrive. And, that also means having your educational needs met as well as your social needs. So having the least restrictive environment and then looking at, based on the information that's collected, what kind of accommodation. So you mentioned IEP, which is an individualized education plan. That's generally for individuals who have a special education diagnosis, or there's a 504 plan, which actually comes from like the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's more complicated, but it's like Section 504. It allows for schools to create accommodations based on a diagnosis. So the diagnosis could be a learning disability, the diagnosis could be ADHD, the diagnosis could be anxiety. So you could have a 504 plan for a variety of different diagnoses. Like, God forbid someone breaks a leg and needs, is in a wheelchair for a period of time or needs special accommodations to hobble around on crutches, you would get a 504 plan in those situations. So there's a lot of reasons to get a 504 plan, but I do like to designate the difference between a 504 plan and an IEP.
Yeah, and I know 504 plans, maybe someday they go away. I think most people want to keep them because it's going to last into college, but things like things you might want in there, like that the teacher checks in to see where they are with their work and then gives them the next step, or breaks things down, or movement breaks. That's a big thing, right? Just having some movement breaks. We understand that sometimes allowing them to move will then allow them to focus.
Absolutely. Movement breaks. Sometimes they have a, special pass to go to the nurse's office, not because they necessarily need to see the nurse, but the act of leaving class and going to a designated place gives them a little bit of a motoric release, and then come back to class. I have a high school student that I'm working with that has a lot of difficulty with organization, and it's been extremely helpful for him to have just his teacher sign that he attended class and that he wrote down what the homework is. So he has a little kind of sheet at the end of every class. He writes down that he attended and that what the homework was. The teacher just initials it. At the end of the day, he shows his mom that it's been initialed by all the teachers, and it's a physical reminder to him of exactly what he needs to do. So these kinds of things, and the teachers know, okay, I got to sign, I have to sign Billy's sheet. I changed the name, but
okay, yeah.
So there's different accommodations that can be done. There's things like preferential seating, especially with younger kids. Some of these kids actually do better when they're sitting in the front of the classroom, not in the back of the classroom where there's 25 distractions in front of them, and that really just gets them off task.
Yeah. So let's talk about if it tends to be hidden, and sometimes in girls we talk about hidden ADHD where they don't seem to be very restless, but yet a lot of it might be more internal, and it almost looks like it could be anxiety, right? So how do we tease that out?
So that is really important, what we call rule out, right? Is this anxiety based? And that often has to do with the kind of the onset or the origin of what's going on. Like, did this just seem to come about more in the past month or so, where it's just been this school year, and there's been some particular stressors that we can point to? So then I would go after more of like an anxiety-based diagnosis. And the reason that's important is because the treatment can be different. So that's why it is important to really understand what the origin is. As I said, in girls, on the developmental trajectory, they tend to have more of the inattentive type. So it's like, well, my daughter's had some of these issues, but now it's, she's in 9th grade and there's a lot of work being thrown at her, and she's got 6 classes a day, and she just can't seem to ever keep straight whatever's going on in each class. So now that's, speaking to more of an organizational issue. Now, that doesn't mean you might not build some anxiety on top of that, because now you realize you're getting behind. So that's why I think when it gets a slightly more complicated, having either an educational consultant or a mental health professional work with you can be really helpful.
Yeah, and maybe to work with the school. And I'm wondering how we advocate, because sometimes you get these teachers who are really, really good and really want to help and see that, a few tweaks can make a huge difference. And other times you really have to advocate. So talk about what parents can or should be doing to advocate for their kids, both in public schools and private schools.
So I just talked about this in supervision with one of the interns yesterday, right? There's a couple different factors. I mean, I'm just going to be honest that there are some vast differences in how school districts in this state manage accommodations and manage, what needs to happen for a more individualized plan for students. There's vast differences. Some school systems are great with it. Some school systems are not as good with it. But parent advocacy is almost always needed in either situation, because it's parent advocacy that helps the school recognize that, okay, this child has issues. I have a parent here that I need to answer to. So therefore, we're going to stay on top of these accommodations. So I do think this is a situation where the squeaky wheel does get the grease, and parents, I would not ever recommend just, okay, my child has a education plan or has a 504 plan. I can just sit back. You want to have, quarterly meetings. You want to stay on top of it, because it's your involvement in your child's education that makes a complete difference.
Okay, which makes sense when they're young and you have these meetings set up. But what if their kids are a little older, and sometimes what you'll hear is, oh, we don't really get parents involved. We need to teach them to be on their own. But what we know from ADHD is that, right, the brain's wired a little differently, and also even the self-advocacy or all of that could be a little bit more immature than classmates. So how do we, as the kid gets older, be the squeaky wheel, but in a way that, maybe in high school where they're thinking they don't want a lot of parent involvement anymore? Yeah,
and again, that, it's different from even in high school, 9th grade to 12th grade, right? So with 9th and 10th graders, you might be a little bit more involved. Again, I don't know that it's necessarily going to be helpful for a parent to be checking their, whatever the program is. Each school district has different programs, checking their program. You missed an assignment, if they need that level of intervention, they might need a case manager or someone at school that's going to help them, because it's best to take some of that or keep some of that in the school where that's where the work is due, and that's where the organizational issues are coming about, or that's where the inattention really is showing itself. You want to keep that managed within the school system when possible, as opposed to having the parent manage it. Yes, the goal is over the course of 4 years that by 11th and 12th grade, the child's developed a little bit more internal control or better systems, organizational systems to manage it, because that's what it is. It's managing it. It doesn't necessarily go away.
Yeah. We're going to take a minute and hear from one of our sponsors and then come back and also talk about some of the emotional impacts of ADHD.
Struggling with gambling? Wheeler Health's Better Choice program offers personalized support and treatment to help you regain control. Visit wheelerhealth.org to learn more and take the first step towards recovery today.
All right, we're talking about ADHD because it's ADHD Awareness Month, and I'm here with Dr. Laura Saunders. And, I think we've done shows on autism, Dr. Saunders, about if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And in a way, I think you would say the same with ADHD. There are these core symptoms, but it can be different. And for some people, some of the biggest symptoms they have are perhaps emotional regulation, where they can get really upset and bothered, and maybe they feel things more intensely. And how do you deal with that?
So that's a great point. So yes, and you can imagine that if you are, let's again start with that younger child, elementary school age or early middle school age, and these kids, they at times can struggle in a school environment. So when that's happening, they get a lot of negative feedback. Stop tapping your pencil. Stop talking to the person next to you. Why didn't you turn this homework in? You can imagine daily negative pieces of feedback that are coming at you over years really starts to wear on you. So a lot of these individuals have, more difficulties in self-esteem and self-worth. They get frustrated very easily. So therefore they are quick to give up on things. They have difficulty regulating their emotions. And again, in part because of the underlying deficits, but also because of the external environment and the way that things are set up. So yes, regulating one's emotions, controlling your frustration, right? So there's impulse control, but right under impulse control is frustration tolerance, right? So when you're an impulsive person, you're just kind of doing things and not really thinking in advance. In part, it's because you don't have an ability to tolerate frustration. And so you just act and react to things. And then you get some negative feedback, and then you get frustrated, and then it causes some, dysregulation in your emotions as well. It's like a feedback loop.
Yeah, and it can be difficult for kids at school with their friends, or even older people with their relationships. How do we deal with those parts? What type of treatments might help? I know medication can help some people, but in addition?
Yeah, I think it really is finding the right setting for a lot of these individuals. Individuals who need more physical activity should not be working in a very sedate field, right? I mean, I think honestly, and I say this, with a lot of care, that a lot of individuals in the trades are in the trades because they just need more, they're not meant to be in desk jobs. They need things that are more physical. We need our plumbers and electricians and our HVAC folks. And those are individuals that may not have done so well in just sort of the paper and pencil, more contained aspect of school. And so great, we have found them or helped them fit into different areas that help them flourish. I mean, that's what's great about some of our trade schools, our tech schools, is that they have all these types of activities that really work well with individuals who are not going to be so, contained.
Yeah.
So it's about finding that right fit.
Yeah, and I know, in doing research on this and doing shows on this for so long, a lot of our a lot of our folks who are entrepreneurs, or I interviewed the man who founded JetBlue, and he said if it weren't for his ADHD, he couldn't have founded JetBlue because he thought outside of the box. But he learned he needed a good team. He has these great ideas, but needs someone to dot the I's and cross the T's to help him execute. So sometimes you can have these really amazing creative endeavors, and so that's one of the treatments, if you want to call it a treatment, I've heard, is finding something that someone with ADHD wants to do, a job they love or an activity they love. That really fuels their want to finish things.
Right. It maximizes their skills. It focuses on their strengths, and it's like best fit. I mean, we don't need to go into a whole thing on the education system, but I do think we do a disservice for a subgroup of individuals. Not everyone's meant to go to a 4-year college. There are lots of things that people can do that fit better with their individual strengths or their deficits, and there's lots of different things that people can do that it just requires a bit of thinking outside the box.
Yeah. So in closing, we've got the major symptoms. Let's talk about lifestyle. We know that movement, exercise, hugely important. If you think about what's happening in the brain with ADHD, the dopamine is low. So getting up in the morning, having some basics of movement, having protein so you can create those neurotransmitters. I mean, let's talk about some of the things that you could maybe make a difference compared to what you're doing now.
Yeah, I think it starts with parenting, right? Understanding that your child is just wired a little bit different, and allowing some of those accommodations, building some of those accommodations into the school day, allowing more movement, a little bit more activity, more breaks, less, time pressure, because that's not necessarily how they work their best. And it's about the education as well. It's educating the individual, the family, the system, and really trying to focus on their strengths, not so much of their deficits.
So what would your word be to parents when, then they're saying, it's very typical that they'll be missing assignments or incomplete instructions. And a lot of times parents tend to get mad about that. You have to do your schoolwork. You don't want to excuse kids with ADHD, but there's also, you want to empower. So how do you do that and still hold them responsible?
Right. I mean, in a nutshell, that it's not easy, but there's a difference between having expectations, right? We need to have expectations for our kids. We need them to rise to challenges. So you can have expectations, but those expectations really need to be grounded in what the capabilities and strengths are of your child. And you can have 2 or 3 children in a family, 4 children in a family, and their strengths are very different. So your expectations can be different as well. And so if expectations are too high and your child's always, kind of falling short, what that's going to make them feel is that they're inadequate. So why bother trying, right?
Yeah.
It's, that fear of success or fear of failure, depending upon the direction that you're going in. So you want to have really appropriate expectations and then push them to their limit, and then a step beyond, but really not setting them up for failure.
It's a good idea there. All of that very important. So listen to this, share it with someone that you love who has ADHD. Thanks for being with us, as always, Dr. Laura Saunders.
Thank you, Kara.
All right, have a great day, everyone. And thanks for watching Kara's Cures. Be well.
CURES, sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.